Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Nobody tells you how loud silence can be, until you find yourself surrounded by nothing but frozen emptiness. My name is irrelevant now, but what happened to me in March 2018 changed everything about how I understand survival, fear, and the absolute indifference of nature. At 34, fresh off a divorce that had gutted my savings and my sense of self, I had taken a contract job with a telecommunications company installing satellite equipment in remote Alaskan villages. The pay was exceptional, the kind of money that made you overlook the fact that you would be flying in tiny aircraft over landscapes that looked like they belonged on another planet. I had grown up in suburban Minnesota, spent my 20s chasing a career in network engineering, and somehow ended up agreeing to spend 6 weeks bouncing between communities that most Americans could not find on a map. The irony of running away from one kind of isolation straight into another was not lost on me. But desperation makes you brave in stupid ways. The morning of the crash started like any other workday in that strange chapter of my life. I woke up at 5 in the morning in a small motel in Bethel, a hub town in southwestern Alaska that served as my base of operations. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee, and frost had crystallized on the inside of the single window, despite the heater running all night. My pilot for the day was a guy named Dean Archer, a wiry man in his early 50s with sun-damaged skin and the kind of calm demeanor that either meant he was incredibly competent or completely checked out. He had been flying bush routes for over 2 decades, and when I met him at the airstrip that morning, he was already doing his pre-flight check on a Cessna 185 that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was faded, patches of primer showing through in spots, but Dean assured me she was mechanically sound. We were headed to a village called Akiak, about 40 miles northeast, then continuing to 2 other communities before looping back. The whole trip was supposed to take 6 hours, weather permitting. We took off around 7:30, just as the sun was beginning to paint the horizon in shades of pale orange and pink. From the air, the Alaskan tundra in late winter is something that defies description. An endless white canvas broken only by dark ribbons of frozen rivers, and the occasional cluster of spruce trees that looked like black needles poking through a bedsheet. Dean was not much of a talker, which suited me fine. He communicated in short bursts, pointing out landmarks, mentioning changes in weather patterns, occasionally adjusting the radio to check in with other pilots in the area. The Cessna hummed along steadily, and despite the cramped quarters and the constant vibration that made my teeth feel loose, I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the flight. We completed the first 2 stops without incident, me hauling my equipment cases through snow that came up to my knees, Dean smoking cigarettes by the plane, and chatting with locals who seemed to know him by name. By early afternoon, we were headed to our final destination before turning back, a village called Tuluksak that sat along the Kuskokwim River. That is when the engine coughed. It was a sound so subtle that I almost missed it. A brief stutter in the constant drone that had become background noise. Dean's reaction told me everything I needed to know. His hands tightened on the yoke, and his eyes flicked to the instrument panel with an intensity that had been absent all day. He did not say anything at first, just started flipping switches and adjusting controls with movements that were quick but deliberate. The engine coughed again, longer this time, and the plane shuddered in a way that made my stomach clench. We were flying over a stretch of wilderness that had no villages, no roads, nothing but white emptiness stretching to the horizon in every direction. Dean grabbed the radio and started transmitting our position, his voice steady but urgent, using terminology I did not fully understand. I remember looking out the window and seeing the shadow of our plane skating across the snow below, and thinking how small we were, how insignificant against that vast frozen landscape. The engine sputtered a 3rd time, then died completely, and the sudden silence was the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. Dean became a different person in those moments. The laid-back pilot who had been cracking dry jokes about moose and complaining about his ex-wife transformed into something mechanical, precise, almost robotic. He told me to tighten my seatbelt and brace for impact, his voice flat and controlled, like he was reading from a manual. The Cessna became a glider, the only sounds now the wind rushing past the fuselage and the creak of the airframe as Dean fought to maintain control. He was looking for a place to land, scanning the terrain below with desperate focus. But there was nothing. No frozen lakes flat enough, no clearings wide enough, just rolling hills of snow and clusters of willows, and the occasional boulder poking through like a gray tooth. I remember praying, something I had not done since childhood, bargaining with a God I was not sure I believed in. The ground rushed up at us with sickening speed, and Dean pulled back on the yoke, trying to flatten our descent. We clipped something, a buried log, a snowdrift, I never found out, and the plane spun violently to the left. The world became a tumbling chaos of white and gray, and the shriek of metal tearing apart. The impact itself is fragmented in my memory, broken into snapshots that do not quite connect. I remember the windshield exploding inward, a spray of glass and snow and cold air hitting my face. I remember the sensation of being thrown forward against my restraint so hard that the breath was crushed out of my lungs. I remember a sound like a giant crumpling a tin can, and then a sharp, blinding pain in my left leg that made me scream. When everything stopped moving, I was hanging sideways in my seat, the plane resting at an angle with the crumpled nose buried in a snowbank. Blood was dripping somewhere. I could hear it, a soft pattering sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. My vision swam in and out of focus, and for a long moment I just hung there, trying to understand what had happened, trying to remember how to breathe. The cold was already seeping in through the shattered windshield, a cold so intense it felt like being stabbed with thousands of tiny needles. I turned my head to look at Dean, and that is when I saw that he was not moving. His body slumped forward against the yoke, a dark stain spreading across the snow beneath his door. Getting out of that seatbelt took what felt like an eternity. My fingers were already going numb, fumbling with the release mechanism while my legs screamed in protest every time I shifted my weight. When I finally got free, I half fell, half crawled toward Dean, dragging myself across the tilted cabin floor that was now slick with hydraulic fluid and melting snow. Up close, I could see the damage. A piece of the instrument panel had broken loose during impact and caught him in the chest, and there was so much blood soaking through his jacket that I knew before I even checked for a pulse. Dean Archer, who had flown these routes for 23 years, who had told me just that morning about his daughter's wedding coming up in June, was dead. I sat there in the wreckage next to his body, shivering uncontrollably, my breath coming out in ragged white clouds, and I felt something inside me threaten to crack wide open, but the cold would not let me grieve. It demanded action, demanded movement, demanded that I focus on the only thing that mattered now, not dying in this frozen nowhere alongside a man I had known for less than 8 hours. I forced myself to assess the situation with whatever clarity I could muster through the shock and the pain. My left leg was badly injured. I could see the bone pressing against the skin just below my knee, not broken through but close, the whole limb swelling rapidly and turning colors that legs should not turn. I had cuts on my face and hands from the shattered windshield, and my ribs ached in a way that suggested at least one was cracked. The plane was destroyed beyond any hope of repair, but the fuselage was mostly intact, which meant shelter of a sort. Outside, the temperature was somewhere around 15 below zero, and the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. In March, this far north, we only had maybe 5 hours of usable daylight left. I crawled to the back of the cabin where my equipment cases had been stored and found them scattered and broken open, satellite components and tools strewn everywhere. But underneath the wreckage, I found my backpack with a spare jacket, 2 granola bars, a thermos of coffee that was somehow still intact, and a cigarette lighter I had been carrying even though I quit smoking 3 years prior. Not much, not nearly enough, but something. The hours that followed exist in my memory as a blur of pain, cold, and desperate improvisation. I knew from the survival training the company had given us, a half-day seminar that I'd mostly slept through, that staying with the aircraft was the right call. The wreckage would be easier for search teams to spot than a single person wandering through the wilderness, and the fuselage offered at least some protection from the wind that had started to pick up, driving the temperature even lower. I used pieces of torn insulation in my spare jacket to plug the hole where the windshield had been, working with fingers that had lost most of their feeling, cursing and crying and talking to myself just to fill the terrible silence. Dean's body was still in the pilot seat, and I could not bring myself to move him, so I just tried not to look in that direction. The radio was destroyed, crushed in the impact along with most of the instrument panel. I found the emergency locator transmitter under the rear seat, but the casing was cracked, and the indicator light that should have been blinking was dark and dead. Our last known position had been transmitted before we went down, but Dean had been in the middle of giving coordinates when the engine failed. I had no idea if anyone knew where we were, or if they were even looking yet. The sun set around 6 in the evening, and the darkness that followed was unlike anything I had experienced before. In Minnesota, even on the darkest winter nights, there was always some ambient light, street lamps, distant highways, the glow of civilization on the horizon. Out here, there was nothing. The blackness was so complete that I could not see my hand in front of my face, and the only sounds were the wind howling across the tundra and the occasional groan of the aircraft's twisted frame settling in the snow. I rationed the coffee, taking small sips to keep my core temperature up, and ate half of one granola bar, even though I had no appetite. My leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and the pain had evolved from sharp and immediate to a deep, pulsing throb that synced with my heartbeat. I knew that was bad. The body going into shock, blood pooling in damaged tissue, the beginning of a process that could kill me just as surely as the cold. I tried to elevate the leg, propping it on one of the equipment cases, and I wrapped it as tightly as I could with strips torn from the cabin seat covers. Sleep was impossible. Every time I started to drift off, the cold would jolt me awake, or the pain would spike, or I would hear something outside, real or imagined, that sent my heart racing. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the darkness that felt like a small miracle. I had survived the night, though I was not sure how much longer I could hold on. My leg had turned a mottled purple-black color that terrified me, and I had stopped being able to feel my toes sometime around 3 in the morning. The second granola bar went down in small bites, washed down with the last of the cold coffee, and I tried to make a plan. Movement was nearly impossible. Every attempt to put weight on my injured leg sent bolts of agony shooting up into my hip and made my vision go white at the edges. But staying still meant freezing, meant letting hypothermia creep deeper into my body with every passing hour. I decided to try and make some kind of signal, something that searchers might see from the air. Using the lighter and some of the aircraft's insulation material, I managed to start a small fire in a metal container I had salvaged from the wreckage. The smoke rose in a thin gray column against the pale sky, and I fed it with whatever I could find. Pieces of fabric, paper from the flight manual, strips of plastic that sent up black plumes. It was pitiful, really. A tiny thread of smoke in an endless white wilderness. But it was something to focus on, something to do besides lie there and wait for death. The second day passed in a haze of pain and cold and creeping despair. I talked to Dean's body, apologizing for things that made no sense, telling him about my failed marriage and my estranged sister, and the dog I had left with my ex-wife. I hallucinated at some point, saw my mother standing outside the shattered windshield, wearing the yellow dress she had been buried in, asking me why I had not called more often. The fire went out, and I could not get it started again. My fingers too clumsy, my coordination too far gone. I noticed that I had stopped shivering, and some distant part of my brain remembered that this was a very bad sign, that shivering was the body's way of generating heat, and when it stopped it meant you were in the final stages of hypothermia. I thought about giving up. The idea floated through my mind with a strange serenity. Just close my eyes, Let the cold take me. Stop fighting against something that was clearly inevitable. I probably would have done it too. I was ready. But then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the wind and the fog in my brain, the distant thump of helicopter rotors. I do not remember much of what happened next, just fragments and sensations. I remember trying to wave, to make some kind of movement that would catch their attention, but my arms felt like they belonged to someone else. I remember the helicopter getting louder, circling overhead, and the overwhelming relief that flooded through me when I realized they had seen the wreckage. I remember voices, hands reaching for me, the painful brightness of a flashlight in my eyes. Someone was asking me questions, my name, where I was hurt, how long I had been out there, but my mouth would not form the words. They cut me out of the fuselage with tools that screamed and sparked, and then I was being lifted onto a stretcher, strapped down, carried through the snow toward the waiting helicopter. The warmth inside the aircraft hit me like a physical blow, and I started crying without meaning to, tears freezing on my cheeks before someone wiped them away. A paramedic was working on my leg, cutting away the makeshift bandages I had wrapped around it, and I saw his face go pale when he saw what was underneath. He said something to his partner that I could not hear over the rotor noise. But the look they exchanged told me everything. They put an IV in my arm and covered me with thermal blankets that felt like being wrapped in fire, and at some point I finally let myself slip into unconsciousness. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Anchorage, missing my left leg below the knee. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, that another few hours in that cold would have finished what the crash had started. The rescue team had found me thanks to a combination of factors. Dean's partial transmission had given them a general search area. A pilot flying a different route had spotted the smoke from my signal fire the previous day, and the Alaska State Troopers had coordinated a search effort that covered hundreds of square miles. They told me that Dean had died on impact, that he probably never felt any pain, and I choose to believe that even though I know they might have been saying it just to make me feel better. The company paid for my medical bills and my rehabilitation, and I got a settlement that was generous enough to let me start over somewhere warmer. I live in New Mexico now, working a desk job for a different telecommunications company, and I have not been on an airplane of any size since that day in March 2018. Sometimes I still dream about it, the endless white, the cold that felt like it was eating me from the inside out, the sound of Dean's last radio transmission cutting off mid-sentence. I wake up sweating despite the desert heat, reaching for a leg that is no longer there, and I have to remind myself that I made it out, that I survived. But a part of me is still out there in that frozen wilderness, sitting in the wreckage of a Cessna 185, watching the sun set and wondering if anyone is coming. That part of me never left, and I do not think it ever will. After my college graduation in 2015, my best friends and I made a pact to take one big adventure together before life pulled us in different directions. Mitch had just finished his EMT certification, and Carrie was about to start law school in September, so we had this narrow window in late August to do something wild. Alaska seemed perfect, raw, remote, untouched. Mitch had a cousin who worked on a fishing boat near Valdez, and he told us about this abandoned hunting lodge, about 40 miles from the nearest town, deep in the Chugach Mountains. The place had been closed since the early 90s, after the owner died, and nobody claimed the property. We figured we would hike out there, spend a couple of nights, take some photos, maybe see some wildlife. None of us could have imagined what was waiting in that rotting wooden structure, or that only 2 of us would make it back to civilization. We flew into Anchorage on a Thursday morning, rented a Jeep, and drove 6 hours to a small town called Copper Junction. Just a gas station, a general store, and maybe 15 houses scattered along a gravel road. The woman at the general store, a weathered lady in her 60s named Ruth, looked at us like we had announced plans to swim with sharks when we mentioned the old Whitaker Lodge. She told us people avoided that area, that hikers had reported seeing figures moving through the trees at night. Strange lights, things that made no sense. Her exact words were that the forest out there had a way of playing tricks on your mind. Mitch laughed it off, called it small-town superstition designed to scare tourists. Carrie and I exchanged a look but said nothing. We bought extra batteries, some canned food, and a paper map since cell service would be non-existent. Ruth watched us leave through the store window, and I remember thinking she looked almost sad, like she was watching people walk toward something terrible and knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. The hike took us nearly 7 hours. The trail, if you could even call it that, disappeared completely after the first 2 miles, and we had to navigate using the map and a compass Mitch brought. The Chugach Mountains are beautiful in a way that feels almost hostile, like the land is reminding you every second that you do not belong there. Spruce trees so thick you could walk 10 feet off the path and lose sight of your friends. Silence so deep that the snap of a twig under your boot sounds like a gunshot. Around mile 6, Carrie spotted something strange carved into a tree trunk, a crude symbol that looked like a stick figure with its arms raised, and below it, letters scratched deep into the bark. Turn back. We stood there staring at it for a long moment. Mitch said it was probably some bored hiker trying to scare people, maybe the same locals who told ghost stories to tourists. But the carving looked old, the edges worn smooth by years of weather. And there was something desperate about those letters, like whoever made them had used a rock or a knife and pressed hard, wanting to make sure the message would last. We reached the lodge just before sunset. The building was larger than I expected, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, most of the windows either broken or boarded up, the roof sagging in the middle like a spine that had given up. Moss covered everything, and there was this smell, thick and sour, that I assumed was just decades of rot and animal droppings. Mitch was the first one through the front door, which hung crooked on its hinges and scraped against the floor when he pushed it open. Inside, the main room still had furniture, a couch with the stuffing torn out, a wooden table covered in dust, a stone fireplace filled with old ashes. But what stopped all 3 of us in our tracks was the kitchen area in the back corner. There were cans of food on the counter, and not old rusted ones from the 90s. These labels were modern, brands I recognized, and when Carrie picked one up, she whispered that the expiration date was still a year away. Someone had been here recently. Someone might still be here. We should have turned around right then, hiked back through the darkness if we had to. But we were tired. It was getting dark fast, and Mitch convinced us that it was probably just another group of hikers who had passed through. We decided to stay the night and leave at first light. That decision haunts me every single day. We set up our sleeping bags in the main room near the fireplace, figuring it was the safest spot since we could see both the front door and the stairs leading to the second floor. Mitch got a small fire going using some dry wood we found stacked behind the couch, another detail that should have alarmed us more than it did, because who stacks firewood in an abandoned building? Carrie was quiet, kept glancing toward the dark hallway that led to what looked like storage rooms in the back. Around 9, she said she needed to use the bathroom and grabbed her flashlight. The outhouse was about 30 yards behind the lodge, a tilted wooden box that somehow still stood despite looking ready to collapse. She was gone for maybe 10 minutes when we heard her scream. Not a startled yelp, but a real scream, the kind that carries pure terror in it. Mitch and I grabbed our flashlights and ran outside, calling her name, our beams cutting through the darkness. We found her standing behind the outhouse, flashlight pointed at the ground, her whole body trembling. She could barely get the words out. She kept saying there were bones, human bones, and when I looked down I saw them too. A scattered pile of what was unmistakably a human rib cage, a femur, fragments of a skull half buried in the dirt. The bones were not fresh, but they were not ancient either. Some still had dried tissue clinging to them. Mitch tried to stay calm, said it could be anything, maybe a hunter who got lost and died of exposure years ago. But Carrie pointed her flashlight a few feet to the left, and there was another pile, and another beyond that. At least 4 distinct groupings of human remains, all within a 20-foot radius of that outhouse, like someone had been dumping bodies there for years. The smell I had noticed earlier, the one I blamed on rot and animals, it suddenly made a different kind of sense. We needed to leave immediately. All of us agreed on that. But it was pitch black now and the trail was impossible to navigate at night. One wrong step and you could fall into a ravine, or walk in circles until exhaustion took you. Mitch said we would barricade ourselves inside, take shifts staying awake, and leave the second the sun came up. We dragged the heavy wooden table against the front door and pushed the couch against the back entrance. Carrie found a rusty hunting knife in one of the drawers and held onto it like her life depended on it, because at that point, we all understood it might. None of us slept. We sat in a triangle facing outward, flashlights ready, listening to every creak and groan of that old building, waiting for morning. Around 3 in the morning, we heard footsteps on the porch. Not animal footsteps. These were heavy, deliberate, human. They moved slowly from one end to the other, paused near the boarded window, then continued around the side of the building. Mitch grabbed a thick piece of firewood and positioned himself near the front door. Carrie had the knife raised, her knuckles white around the handle. I held my flashlight like a weapon, which felt pathetic, but it was all I had. The footsteps stopped at the back entrance, and then came 3 slow knocks on the door. 1, 2, 3. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Then a voice, low and gravelly, muffled through the wood. "I know you're in there. I saw your fire." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mitch whispered for us to stay quiet. Maybe whoever it was would leave if we did not respond. For a long moment there was silence. Then the voice again, closer now, like the person had pressed their face against the door. "This is my home. You're sleeping in my home." The handle jiggled. The couch we had pushed against the door shifted an inch. Carrie let out a small whimper, and I grabbed her arm, squeezing hard, begging her silently to stay quiet. The jiggling stopped. The footsteps retreated, slow and unhurried, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. We heard them circle the building once more, then fade into the forest. For the next 2 hours, nothing. Just the wind and the occasional crack of branches in the distance. By 5, the sky started to lighten, and we made the decision to run. We grabbed our packs, left everything else, and Mitch pulled the table away from the front door. He opened it slowly, checking both directions, and motioned for us to follow. We made it maybe 50 yards into the tree line when Carrie suddenly stopped and pointed back toward the lodge. There was a man standing on the porch, watching us. He was tall, gaunt, with a beard that hung past his chest and clothes so filthy they looked like they had fused to his skin. He did not move, did not chase us, just stood there with his arms at his sides, his head tilted slightly to one side like a curious dog. And then he smiled. Not a threatening smile, but something worse, something empty and patient, like he knew exactly where we were going and had no doubt he would find us again. We ran. We ran faster than I have ever run in my life. Branches whipping our faces, rocks twisting under our feet, not daring to look back. We had been moving for maybe an hour when Mitch stopped and said he needed to check the map. We were lost. Nothing looked familiar, and in our panic we had veered completely off the route we had marked the day before. The forest was dense here, the trees so close together that sunlight barely penetrated, and everything looked the same in every direction. Carrie was crying quietly, trying to muffle the sound with her sleeve. I kept scanning the trees behind us, expecting to see that gaunt figure emerge at any moment. Mitch spread the map on a fallen log and tried to orient us using the compass, but his hands were unsteady and the needle kept jumping. That is when we heard it. A sharp whistle, high-pitched and deliberate, coming from somewhere to our left. Then another whistle answered from the right, and a third from behind us. There was more than one person out there. The man at the lodge was not alone. Mitch shoved the map in his pack and grabbed Carrie by the arm, pulling her forward. We picked a direction and moved as fast as we could, trying to stay quiet but knowing that whoever was out there already knew exactly where we were. The whistles continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, like they were hurting us somewhere specific. Around midday, we stumbled into a small clearing and found another carved message on a tree. This one was newer, the letters still pale against the dark bark. No one comes. Below it, scratched in smaller, shakier writing, "He keeps us here." Carrie started hyperventilating, and I had to hold her face in my hands and force her to look at me, to breathe with me, to stay focused. Mitch was pacing the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of a trail, when the attack came. The man appeared from nowhere. Not the bearded one from the lodge, but someone younger, faster, wearing torn military fatigues and carrying a length of rusted chain. He swung it at Mitch before any of us could react, catching him across the back of the shoulders and sending him sprawling into the dirt. Carrie screamed and lunged with her knife, slashing wildly, and caught the attacker across the forearm. He howled and stumbled backward, giving Mitch enough time to scramble to his feet. I grabbed a rock the size of my fist and threw it as hard as I could, hitting the man in the chest. He looked at me with these pale, empty eyes, not angry, not pained, just hollow, and then retreated into the trees as quickly as he had appeared. Mitch was bleeding through his shirt, deep welts already forming where the chain had struck. We had to keep moving. For the next 3 hours, we pushed through the forest with no real sense of direction, just desperate to put distance between us and whoever was hunting us. Mitch was slowing down, the pain in his back making every step a struggle, and Carrie had gone silent in a way that scared me more than her crying had. The whistles had stopped, which somehow felt worse, like they had decided to let us exhaust ourselves before closing in. Around 4 in the afternoon, I heard something that made me want to collapse with relief. The sound of running water. We followed it and found a river, maybe 30 feet wide, moving fast with snowmelt from the mountains. I remembered from the map that a river ran near the main road about 15 miles from where we had started. If we followed it downstream, we might find civilization. We waded in, the cold shocking the breath out of us, and let the current carry us as much as we could manage while keeping our footing. Mitch slipped twice, and the second time, Carrie and I had to drag him up before the water pulled him under. We stayed in that river for what felt like hours, our legs going numb, our teeth chattering so hard I thought they might crack. But nobody followed us into the water. Whatever advantage they had in the forest, the river took it away. Just before sunset, we saw a bridge in the distance. A real bridge, concrete and metal, with a gravel road running across it. We climbed out of the river on shaking legs and stumbled up the embankment to the road. A pickup truck came by within 20 minutes, driven by a man named Earl who took one look at us and did not ask questions, just told us to get in. He drove us straight to a state trooper station in a town called Ridgewater, about 60 miles from Copper Junction. We told them everything, the lodge, the bones, the man on the porch, the whistles, the attack. They listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to something darker as we spoke. One of the troopers, a woman with gray streaks in her hair, finally said they had been looking for a man named Vernon Crisp for almost 8 years. He had escaped from a corrections facility in 2007, serving time for multiple counts of kidnapping and assault. They had assumed he fled to Canada or died in the wilderness. Instead, he had built himself a compound out there, attracting other fugitives, other broken men who wanted to disappear. The trooper said they had received reports over the years, hikers talking about ghosts in the forest, strange figures, carved warnings, but nobody had ever come back with enough information to launch a real search. Until us. The raid happened 3 days later. State troopers, FBI, search and rescue teams. They went in with helicopters and dogs and enough manpower to sweep every inch of that mountain. They found Vernon Crisp in the lodge, sitting in a chair by the fireplace like he had been expecting them. He did not resist. The 2 other men they captured in the surrounding forest put up more of a fight, but both were taken alive. What they found behind that lodge was worse than anything we had seen. 17 sets of remains, some dating back to the late 90s, others much more recent. They also found a root cellar about 100 yards from the main building, dug into the hillside and hidden by brush. Inside were journals, dozens of them, written by people who had been kept there, some for weeks, some for months. The entries described everything: the captures, the isolation, The way Vernon would release them into the forest and hunt them for sport. The way some prisoners were forced to help him in exchange for their lives. Those carved warnings we had seen on the trees were made by the ones who managed to escape the cellar briefly. Desperate attempts to warn anyone who might come after them. Most of those people never made it out of the forest. Their bones ended up behind the outhouse with all the others. Mitch spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from an infection that developed in his wounds. Carrie finished law school but changed her focus to victims advocacy. She works with families of missing persons now, helps them navigate the system when the police stop looking. I still live in the same apartment I had before Alaska, still work the same job, still see the same people. But something fundamental broke inside me during those hours in the forest. I check the locks on my doors 4 or 5 times before I can sleep. I cannot hear a whistle without my chest tightening. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Ruth at that general store, how she tried to warn us and we laughed it off as superstition. The ghosts she talked about were real. They were just made of flesh and bone, like us. That is the thing nobody tells you about monsters. They do not need to be supernatural to destroy you. They just need to be patient and hidden, and willing to wait for the next group of people who think the wilderness is empty. It never is. I know that now. I will never forget it. Every summer since my dad passed, I make the trip up to the Kenai Peninsula to fish for sockeye salmon. It started as a way to feel close to him again, doing something we used to do together when I was a teenager. But over the years it became my thing, my way of resetting before another school year of teaching 4th graders in Seattle. My birthday falls in late July, and turning 37 alone on a riverbank with nothing but the sound of rushing water and birdsong felt like exactly what I needed. I had been doing this solo trip for 6 years without any real incident. A few close calls with moose, one scary moment when I slipped on wet rocks and almost went into the current, but nothing that made me question whether I should keep coming back. The spot I always use is about 4 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a trail that most people skip because there are easier fishing spots closer to civilization. That remoteness was always the appeal. I flew into Anchorage on a Tuesday morning and picked up my rental truck, a beat-up Ford that smelled like cigarettes and prior renters who did not believe in air freshener. The drive down to the peninsula took about 4 hours, and I stopped in Soldotna to grab last-minute supplies and check in with the ranger station like I always do. The guy working the desk, a younger ranger I had not seen before, warned me about increased bear activity in the area. He said the salmon run was strong this year, which meant the browns were coming down from higher elevations earlier than usual. I thanked him and told him I had bear spray and air horn and knew how to store my food properly. He gave me this look, not condescending exactly, but like he wanted to say something more and decided against it. I wish now that I had asked him what he was thinking. I wish I had paid more attention to the weight behind that look, instead of brushing it off as a ranger doing his job. The hike in took me about 2.5 hours with my pack, which was heavier than usual, because I had brought extra food for a 5-day stay. I reached my usual campsite around 4 in the afternoon, plenty of daylight left to set up, and maybe get a few casts in before dinner. The spot sits on a slight rise about 60 feet from the riverbank, sheltered by a thick stand of spruce trees on 3 sides. The river curves there, creating a natural pool where the salmon tend to gather before pushing upstream. I had caught my limit here every single year. I set up my tent, hung my food cache from the bare wire that someone had installed years ago between 2 tall spruces, and took a walk down to the water to check conditions. The river was running a bit higher than I remembered from previous years, probably from snowmelt, and the water had that murky, glacial color that makes it hard to see more than a few inches below the surface. I noticed fish jumping out near the middle of the current, silver flashes catching the late afternoon sun, and I felt that familiar excitement in my chest. That first evening was perfect. I caught 3 nice sockeyes before the light started fading, kept 2 and released 1, and cooked dinner on my little camp stove while listening to the river. I did everything right with my food prep, cleaned the fish downstream from my camp, washed my hands and arms thoroughly, changed into clean clothes that I kept sealed in a dry bag. I was careful. I am always careful. Around 10, which is still pretty bright that far north in July, I noticed movement on the opposite bank. Maybe 200 yards away, a large brown shape moving through the brush. I could not see it clearly, but I knew what it was from the way it moved, that distinctive rolling gait. It did not seem interested in me, just working its way along the far shore, probably fishing in its own spots. I watched until it disappeared into the trees. Then I got into my tent and zipped everything up tight. I remember thinking how lucky I was to see one from a safe distance. I remember feeling grateful, not scared. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving through the brush near my tent. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lay completely still, barely breathing, my hand wrapped around the bear spray I always keep next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled. I could track them by sound, moving from the tree line behind my tent toward the river, then back again. At one point they stopped, and I heard this sound, a deep huffing breath followed by a low grunt. It was close enough that I could smell it, that musky, wet dog smell mixed with something rotten, probably fish. I do not know how long I lay there, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, the sounds moved off toward the river and I heard splashing in the distance. I did not sleep again that night. I just lay there with my eyes open, listening to every small noise, my body so tense that my muscles ached by morning. When the sun came up around 5, I got out of my tent to check the area. My legs were shaky and I felt that sick exhaustion you get when adrenaline has been pumping through you for hours. The ground near the tree line was torn up, deep gouges in the soft earth where something had been digging. And then I saw the tracks. They were massive, bigger than any bear print I had ever seen in my 6 years of coming here. I put my boot next to one of them for reference, and the print was easily twice the size of my foot, with claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe pads. I am not a wildlife expert, but I have seen enough brown bear tracks to know that this was an unusually large animal. The tracks led from the woods to a spot maybe 20 feet from my tent, circled around, and then headed down toward the river. I stood there looking at how close they came to where I had been sleeping, separated by nothing but a thin layer of nylon, and I seriously considered packing up and hiking out right then, but I talked myself out of it. That is what I keep coming back to. That moment of decision. I told myself the bear was just passing through, that it had not tried to get into my food cache, that it was probably more interested in the salmon than in me. I told myself I had driven 8 hours and hiked 4 miles, and I was not going to let one close encounter ruin my trip. I checked my food hang, which was untouched, and I made noise while I cooked breakfast, banging pots together and talking loudly to myself like all the guides recommend. I even did some fishing that morning, though I stayed closer to camp than usual, and kept my bear spray clipped to my waders at all times. I caught 1 salmon and released it because I did not want to deal with cleaning fish and creating more smells. The whole time I was on the water, I kept scanning the banks, the tree line, the bend in the river where I had seen the bear the night before. Nothing. The day was bright and warm, birds singing, river flowing, and I started to relax a little. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was sitting on a rock near the water, eating a granola bar and resting my feet when I saw it. The bear emerged from the brush on my side of the river, maybe 150 yards upstream. It was enormous, easily the biggest brown bear I had ever seen outside of photographs. Its fur was dark brown, almost chocolate-colored, with a distinctive silver patch on its shoulder. It walked to the water's edge and stood there, and then it turned its head and looked directly at me. I want to be clear about this because it matters. The bear saw me. It knew I was there. And instead of doing what bears usually do when they encounter humans, instead of running away or at least moving off, it started walking toward me along the riverbank. Not charging, not running, just walking, steady and deliberate, like it had somewhere to be and I was on the path. I stood up slowly and grabbed my bear spray with one hand and my air horn with the other. I started backing away from the river toward my campsite, keeping the bear in my sight the whole time. I pressed the air horn, and the blast echoed across the water, loud enough to hurt my ears. The bear paused for a second, maybe two, then kept coming. I yelled and waved my arms over my head, trying to make myself look bigger. Nothing. It just kept that same steady pace, closing the distance between us. 75 yards now, maybe less. I could see its face clearly. The small dark eyes, the dish-shaped profile, the way its ears were pointed forward with focus and intent. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I knew that was the worst thing I could do. You cannot outrun a brown bear. You cannot outswim one either. I kept backing up, stumbling over rocks and roots, and I hit the air horn again, 3 short blasts. The bear did not even flinch. It reached the spot where I had been sitting and it stopped there, sniffing the rock, sniffing the ground where I had dropped my granola bar wrapper. And then it lifted its head and looked at me again, and it made this sound, a low, rumbling grunt that I felt in my chest more than heard. I do not know what made me decide to go for the river. Maybe some survival instinct kicked in, or maybe I just panicked and made a stupid choice. My campsite was behind me, but the bear was between me and the trail that led back to the road. The river was to my left, and on the other side of the river was more wilderness, but at least it was distance. At least it was something. The bear started moving again, faster now, and I turned and ran for the water. The cold hit me like a wall when I plunged in, that glacial runoff so cold it locks up your muscles and steals your breath. I was only in up to my waist, but the current was strong, pulling at me, and I could barely feel my legs. I pushed forward, half swimming and half wading, trying to reach the far bank. I heard splashing behind me, and I did not look back. I just kept going, my arms numb and clumsy in the freezing water. The riverbed was all loose rocks and sudden drop-offs, and twice I went under, swallowing water that tasted like ice and silt. When I finally dragged myself onto the opposite bank, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I turned around, expecting to see the bear swimming after me or already on my side of the river. But it was just standing at the edge of the water on the far bank, right where I had gone in, watching me. It did not try to follow, it just stood there, and after a minute or two it turned and walked back toward my campsite, disappearing into the trees near where my tent was set up. I was soaking wet, freezing, starting to feel that dangerous sleepiness that comes with hypothermia. And all my gear, my food, my truck keys, my phone, everything was on the other side of the river, with a bear that had just chased me into glacial water. I had my bear spray still clutched in my hand, but that was it. No dry clothes, no fire starter, no way to call for help. I started walking downstream along the bank, trying to keep moving, trying to generate body heat. I knew there was a fishing lodge about 6 miles downriver. I had seen it on my map when planning the trip. 6 miles through dense brush and uneven terrain in wet clothes with the temperature dropping as evening approached. I did not think about whether I could make it. I just walked. It took me almost 5 hours to reach that lodge. By the time I stumbled out of the tree line and a guest spotted me, I could not feel my feet and my lips were blue. They wrapped me in blankets and called for a medical helicopter because my core temperature had dropped to 92 degrees, which is apparently when organs start having trouble. I spent 2 nights in a hospital in Anchorage being treated for moderate hypothermia and mild frostbite on 3 of my toes. The Rangers went back to my campsite the next day and found my tent shredded, my food cache pulled down from the wire and scattered everywhere. They found tracks all around the site, the same massive prints I had seen that morning. They told me later that there had been reports of a large male brown bear in that area, exhibiting unusually bold behavior around humans, possibly because someone had been feeding it earlier in the season. They never caught it as far as I know. I still go fishing every summer, but not there, never there again. And every time I see a bear in the distance now, even in a zoo, I feel my chest tighten and I remember that steady walk along the riverbank, those small, dark eyes fixed on me. and I remember how it feels to be looked at not as a threat or a curiosity, but as something else entirely. November in Alaska feels like the world is slowly dying, and that particular November felt worse than most. I had been covering crime stories for the Anchorage Daily Herald since my journalism school graduation back in 2009, staying in this frozen corner of the country because the isolation-bred stories nobody else wanted to touch. My editor dropped a folder on my desk containing 6 missing persons cases spanning 15 years, all connected to an abandoned copper mine called Raven Shaft near a forgotten town named Ketchum Falls. The mine had been closed since 1987 after a collapse killed 4 workers, but hikers and amateur explorers kept wandering in over the decades. None of them came back out. Local authorities had stopped sending search parties after the 3rd disappearance because the cave system was too unstable, too deep, and too cold. The families never got answers. The cases went cold, and something about that silence made me volunteer to investigate. I spent 3 weeks researching before I ever set foot near that mountain. The mine entrance sat about 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough trail that became impassable once the heavy snow arrived in December. I connected with a geological survey team from the University of Fairbanks, who had been trying to get funding to map the cave system for years. Their leader was a woman named Ingrid Solberg, maybe 50 years old with sun-damaged skin and a handshake that could crush walnuts. She had lost a graduate student to Raven Shaft in 2014 and had been petitioning the state to either seal the entrance permanently or fund a proper documentation expedition. When I told her about the article I wanted to write, she offered me something better than an interview. She invited me to join a 5-person team heading into the mine that Friday to recover whatever evidence they could find before winter sealed the mountain for good. I said yes without hesitating, which, looking back, was the first of many mistakes. Our team assembled at a ranger station about 20 miles from the site on a Friday morning, so cold that my breath crystallized on my eyelashes. Besides Ingrid and myself, there was her colleague Desmond Yates, a soft-spoken geologist in his early 60s, who had mapped caves across 3 continents, and 2 younger researchers named Cynthia Park and Jonah Fielding. Cynthia handled the audio and video documentation equipment, a serious woman with cropped black hair who barely spoke during the drive-up. Jonah was the safety coordinator, responsible for the ropes, the harnesses, and the emergency protocols that I prayed we would never need. He had this nervous habit of checking his gear over and over, running his fingers along the carabiners like rosary beads. The ranger who met us was a grizzled man named Cliff Bjornson, who had been stationed in this region for over 20 years. He made us sign liability waivers that essentially said the state of Alaska bore no responsibility if we died in that hole. He also told us that if we were not back by nightfall, nobody was coming to find us until spring. The hike to Raven Shaft took nearly 4 hours through terrain that wanted to kill us with every step. The trail, if you could call it that, wound through dense spruce forest before climbing a rocky slope scattered with loose shale and patches of black ice. Ingrid led the way with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before, though I noticed her pace slow as we approached the final ridge. The mine entrance appeared suddenly, a dark wound in the gray mountainside framed by rotting timber supports that had somehow survived decades of harsh winters. A faded warning sign hung crooked from a rusted chain, the words barely legible beneath layers of grime and lichen. The opening was maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, sloping downward at a steep angle into absolute darkness. Standing there, feeling the cold air rushing up from the depths like the mountain was exhaling, I understood why people called this place cursed. Not because of anything supernatural, but because it felt hungry in a way that only truly dangerous places can feel. We descended into Raven Shaft just after noon, roped together in a line with Jonah at the front and Desmond bringing up the rear. The temperature dropped dramatically within the first 100 feet, and the quality of darkness changed from the soft gray of an overcast day to something thicker, something that seemed to press against our headlamps like a living thing. The main shaft angled downward for about 300 meters before opening into a large chamber that the original miners had used as a staging area. Rusted equipment still littered the floor. Pickaxes and ore carts and coils of ancient rope turned brittle with age. Our boots crunched on a mixture of gravel and ice crystals that had formed over decades of water seeping through microscopic cracks in the rock. Ingrid pointed her light toward the far end of the chamber, where 3 tunnels branched off into different directions, each one disappearing into its own private darkness. She explained that the left tunnel led to the collapsed section where the 4 miners had died in 1987. The middle tunnel went deeper into the mountain, descending another 200 meters before dead-ending at a flooded shaft. The right tunnel was where most of the missing persons had last been seen, according to the sparse evidence that search teams had recovered over the years. We took the right tunnel, moving slowly and carefully along a path that grew narrower with every step. The walls were slick with moisture, and in several places we had to duck beneath rock formations that jutted down like broken teeth. Cynthia documented everything with her camera, capturing the strange beauty and the undeniable menace of a place that had swallowed so many people whole. About 40 minutes into the tunnel, Jonah stopped us with a raised fist. His headlamp had caught something reflective ahead, wedged between 2 rocks near the base of the wall. He crouched down and pulled out a hiking boot, faded orange with a distinctive zigzag pattern on the sole. Inside the boot, still laced tight, was a wool sock. Ingrid checked her files and confirmed that the boot matched the description of gear worn by a hiker named Russell Adkins, a 24-year-old college student who had entered Raven Shaft alone in 2016 and never returned. We found only the one boot, no sign of the other, and no sign of Russell. Cynthia photographed the discovery from multiple angles while I stood there wondering what kind of circumstances would cause someone to leave behind a single boot in a place like this. The tunnel opened into a second chamber about an hour later, smaller than the first but with a higher ceiling that disappeared beyond the reach of our lights. This room felt different immediately, and it took me a moment to understand why. There were signs of habitation everywhere. A sleeping bag lay unrolled against the far wall, its fabric torn and stained with something dark that could have been mud or could have been blood. Nearby sat a camping stove, 2 empty water bottles, a scattered pile of energy bar wrappers, and a backpack with its contents dumped across the stone floor. Ingrid approached the scene carefully, instructing everyone to stay back until she could assess the situation. She crouched beside the backpack and read the name embroidered on its strap, aloud. Gretchen Moody. According to Ingrid's research, Gretchen had been part of a group of 4 amateur spelunkers who entered Raven Shaft in October of 2017. The group had planned a 2-day exploration and packed supplies accordingly. When they failed to return after 5 days, authorities mounted a limited search that recovered nothing. Now we were looking at proof that at least one of them had survived long enough to set up camp deep inside this mountain. Desmond found the audio recorder tucked inside a crevice near the sleeping bag, protected from the elements by an overhang of rock. It was a small digital device, the kind hikers use to document their journeys, and miraculously, the battery still held a faint charge. Ingrid wanted to wait until we returned to the surface to examine the contents, but Cynthia argued that we needed to know what we were dealing with before going any deeper. The group voted, and curiosity won. We gathered in a loose circle, while Cynthia connected the recorder to a portable speaker she carried in her kit. The first file was dated October 17, 2017, recorded in the cheerful voice of a young woman who introduced herself as Gretchen. She described the group's excitement about exploring a cave system that few people had ever documented. The other voices in the background belonged to her companions, a man named Isaac, another woman named Shelley, and a 4th member whose name I could not quite make out through the static. They sounded happy. They sounded alive. And somehow knowing what came next made listening to those first innocent minutes almost unbearable. The second recording was made 2 days later, and the change in tone was immediate. Gretchen's voice trembled as she explained that a rockfall had blocked their exit route. Isaac had tried to find an alternate path but returned after several hours with bad news. Every passage they explored either dead-ended or looped back to the same chamber. Their food was running low. Their flashlight batteries were failing one by one. Shelley had injured her ankle during the initial collapse and could barely walk. The fourth member, whose name was finally clear in this recording as Bo, kept insisting that he had heard movement somewhere deeper in the tunnels. Not animals, he said. Footsteps. Human footsteps. The others dismissed him as paranoid, but Gretchen's voice carried a note of doubt that suggested she was not entirely convinced. The recording ended abruptly with the sound of something falling in the distance, followed by Shelley screaming, and then silence. We sat in that cold chamber, 5 people huddled around a speaker, listening to the echoes of a nightmare that had played out in this exact spot years before we arrived. The third recording was the worst. Gretchen spoke in a whisper, her words rushed and broken by long pauses where she seemed to be listening for something. 6 days had passed since the collapse. Isaac was dead. She did not explain how or why, only that it had happened during an argument about their remaining water supply. Bo had disappeared into one of the side tunnels 2 days earlier and never came back. Shelley's ankle had become infected, and she spent most of her time unconscious, burning with fever. Gretchen described the darkness as a weight pressing down on her chest, the silence broken only by Shelley's labored breathing, and the constant drip of water somewhere in the distance. She mentioned the footsteps again. Bo had been right, she said. Someone else was in these tunnels. She had heard them too, always just beyond the reach of her dying flashlight, always moving away when she called out. She begged whoever found this recording to tell her mother that she had tried to survive. She begged them to bring her body home. The recording ended with a sound that none of us could identify, a low, scraping noise that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, followed by Gretchen whispering a single word that sounded like "run." Nobody spoke for a long time after the recordings ended. Ingrid finally broke the silence by announcing that we had collected enough evidence and needed to begin our ascent before we lost too much daylight. I noticed that her hands moved with a new urgency as she packed the recorder into a protective case. Jonah started organizing our gear for the return journey, counting heads as he always did before any movement. He counted twice, then a third time. His face went pale in the harsh white light of our headlamps, and he asked a question that turned my insides to ice. Where was Desmond? We all looked around the chamber, calling his name into the darkness, our voices bouncing off the wet stone walls and returning to us distorted and strange. Desmond had been standing at the edge of the group just minutes ago, examining some markings on the wall near the tunnel entrance. Now that spot was empty. His pack lay on the ground where he had set it down, but the man himself had vanished without a sound. Cynthia pointed her camera light toward the tunnel we had entered through, then toward 2 smaller passages on the opposite side of the chamber that we had not yet explored. Nothing. No movement. No answer to our increasingly frantic calls. Jonah wanted to search immediately, but Ingrid overruled him with a voice that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. She reminded us of the protocols we had all agreed to before entering the mine. If someone became separated, the group would mark the location, return to the surface, and contact authorities with proper rescue equipment. Going deeper into an unstable cave system to search for a missing person was exactly how more people ended up dead. I understood her logic, but standing there in that chamber surrounded by the belongings of people who had died alone in the dark, the thought of leaving Desmond behind felt monstrous. We compromised. Jonah and I would check the 2 unexplored passages for exactly 5 minutes each, while Ingrid and Cynthia stayed at the camp to maintain a light beacon. The first passage curved sharply after about 30 feet and ended in a wall of collapsed rubble that looked decades old. The second passage went deeper, angling downward at a steep grade, and about 100 feet in, my headlamp caught something that stopped me cold. A footprint in the mud. Fresh. Pointing away from the chamber, heading deeper into the mountain, the tread pattern matched the boots Desmond had been wearing. I called his name one more time, my voice swallowed by the tunnel ahead. Nothing came back except a faint echo and something else. Something that might have been the wind moving through cracks in the rock, or might have been breathing. Jonah grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the chamber. Our 5 minutes were up. When we returned to Ingrid and Cynthia, I told them about the footprint, expecting Ingrid to change her mind about the search. Instead, her expression hardened into something I recognized from years of interviewing people who had made impossible choices. She said that Desmond knew the risks better than any of us. She said that if he had walked deeper into that tunnel on his own, there was a reason, and if he had been taken, then whatever took him was still down there with us. Either way, 3 more bodies would not bring him home. We gathered what evidence we could carry, including Gretchen's recorder and the photographs Cynthia had taken, and we began our ascent. The climb back to the surface felt twice as long as the descent. Every sound made us flinch. Every shadow seemed to move at the edges of our lights. I kept looking back, hoping to see Desmond's familiar silhouette catching up to us, but the darkness behind remained absolute and empty. We emerged from Raven Shaft just as the last gray light of day was fading from the sky. Cliff Bjornsson was waiting at the ranger station with coffee and questions. When we told him about Desmond, his face registered no surprise, only a weary kind of resignation that suggested he had heard this story before. He made calls to the state police and the search and rescue coordinator, but I could tell from his tone that nobody expected a recovery operation. The official report, which I obtained months later through a records request, concluded that Desmond Yates had likely become disoriented in the cave system and fallen into one of the many unmapped shafts that riddled the lower levels. His body was never recovered. The entrance to Raven Shaft was sealed with concrete and steel bars the following spring, and a new sign was erected warning that trespassers would face criminal prosecution. I published my article in February, though the editors cut most of the details about the recordings and focused instead on the broader issue of abandoned mine safety. The families of the missing contacted me for months afterward, desperate for any information I had not included in the story. I told them what I could. I did not tell them about the footsteps that Gretchen heard, or about the fresh boot print leading into darkness, or about the sound I heard just before Jonah pulled me back from that tunnel. A sound like someone whispering my name from very far away, in a voice that almost sounded like Desmond. My truck died somewhere between Talk and Delta Junction on a stretch of highway that looked exactly like the last 100 miles. White, flat, and empty. The temperature gauge had been showing -47 for the past hour, and I remember thinking that number seemed almost fake, like something from a documentary about Antarctica, rather than a road I was actually driving on. I had taken this relocation job from Seattle to Fairbanks because the salary was too good to pass up, and my 10-year high school reunion a few months back had been a reminder that everyone I grew up with was buying houses and having kids while I was still splitting rent with roommates. The plan seemed reasonable when I mapped it out. Drive the Alaska highway in early December, get settled before the holidays, start fresh in January. I had packed blankets, extra food, flares, a full tank of gas, everything the internet told me to bring. But sitting there watching my dashboard light up with warnings before the engine gave one last shudder and went silent, I understood that all the preparation in the world means nothing when you are alone in a place that wants to kill you. I turned the key again and again, maybe 20 times, and each attempt produced a weaker sound until there was nothing but a faint click that reminded me of a dying heartbeat. The heating system stopped the moment the engine quit, and I could feel the cold pushing into the cabin almost immediately, like it had been pressed against the windows just waiting for its chance. I grabbed my phone knowing there would be no signal, and I was right. No bars, no data, nothing but a useless rectangle of glass and metal. Outside, the sun hung low even though my watch said it was barely 2 in the afternoon. That strange Arctic winter light that looks more like a permanent sunset than actual daytime. I figured I had maybe 3 hours before full darkness, and the thought of spending a night in this truck with no heat made my chest tight. I looked out at the road in both directions and saw absolutely nothing. No cars, no buildings, no smoke from distant chimneys, just an endless white plain broken only by the dark line of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and for the first time since I started this drive, I felt genuinely afraid. I tried to remember what I had read about survival in extreme cold. Stay with your vehicle. That was the main advice everywhere online. Your car is shelter, it is visible to rescuers, it protects you from wind. But the articles I had read were written for situations where someone might actually come looking for you, where the temperature was maybe -20 and you could survive a night bundled up in blankets. This was different. At -47, the math changes completely. I had read somewhere that exposed skin gets frostbite in under 5 minutes at these temperatures, that your core body temperature starts dropping almost immediately once you stop producing heat. The blankets I had brought were good for a camping trip, not for a night in an unheated metal box when the air itself feels like it is trying to freeze your lungs. I did the calculation in my head. If no one drove by tonight, and the temperature dropped even further after dark like it always does, I would be dead by morning. That was not pessimism, that was just physics. I remembered passing a sign about 30 minutes back, something about a highway maintenance station 8 miles ahead. At the time I barely noticed it, just another green rectangle on an endless road. Now that sign felt like a lifeline, the only piece of information that might save me. 8 miles was not that far. I had run half marathons before, back when I lived in Seattle, and thought jogging along the waterfront made me some kind of athlete. But 8 miles in this cold, in snow boots and a jacket designed for Pacific Northwest rain rather than Arctic winter, with the sun going down, and no guarantee that the station would even be staffed. That was something else entirely. I sat in the truck for another 10 minutes, watching the windows start to frost over from the inside, feeling my fingers getting stiff even with gloves on. The decision made itself. Staying meant certain death by morning. Walking meant maybe dying, but also maybe living. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with the granola bars and water bottles I had brought, wrapped a scarf around my face until only my eyes were exposed, and stepped out of the truck into cold that hit me like a physical wall. The first breath I took outside felt like inhaling broken glass. The air was so cold that my nostrils stuck together for a second, and I had to breathe through my mouth just to get oxygen in. My eyes watered immediately, and I could feel the moisture trying to freeze on my eyelashes, turning them stiff and clumped. I started walking north along the highway, keeping the asphalt under my feet because I knew that wandering off into the snow would mean losing my sense of direction within minutes. The snow on the road had been packed down by whatever sparse traffic came through, but it was still slippery, and each step required concentration. I told myself to keep a steady pace, not too fast because sweating would be deadly. I had read that wet clothing in extreme cold is basically a death sentence, that the moisture pulls heat from your body faster than the air alone ever could. So I walked like I was on a casual stroll, except every part of my body was screaming that something was wrong, that I should be running, that I needed to get somewhere warm right now. After maybe 20 minutes, I started to notice that I could not feel my toes anymore. I was wearing 2 pairs of socks and my heaviest boots, the ones I had bought specifically for this trip, and none of it mattered. The cold had found a way in, like it always does, creeping through the rubber soles and the insulation and the wool until my feet felt like blocks of wood at the end of my legs. I kept walking because stopping was not an option, but I started doing this thing where I would curl my toes inside my boots, trying to force blood into them, trying to feel anything at all. My fingers were next, even inside the gloves, even tucked into my jacket pockets. The tips went numb first, then the knuckles. Then that numb feeling started creeping up toward my wrists. I checked my watch and realized I had been walking for almost 40 minutes, which meant I had covered maybe 2 miles at most. The maintenance station was still 6 miles away, and the sun had dropped noticeably lower, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they did not mean I was running out of time. Around the 1-hour mark, something changed in my head. I noticed it happening, which is the strange part. I was aware that my thoughts were getting slower, like my brain was a computer running too many programs at once. I would start thinking about something like how far I had walked or whether I should eat one of the granola bars, and then I would just lose the thread of it completely. I found myself stopping in the middle of the road for no reason, just standing there staring at the horizon, and I had to physically force myself to start moving again. My body wanted to stop. Every cell in me was saying, just sit down for a minute, just rest, just take a break. I knew that was the hypothermia talking, that sitting down meant dying. But knowing something and feeling something are two completely different things when your core temperature is dropping and your brain is not getting enough warm blood. I started talking to myself out loud, just to have something to focus on, just to keep my mind from drifting into that soft gray fog that kept trying to swallow my thoughts. The road started to look different after a while, or maybe I was just seeing it differently. I could have sworn there was a building up ahead at one point, a dark shape against the snow, and I walked faster toward it for maybe 5 minutes before realizing it was just a shadow, some trick of the fading light on the landscape. That scared me more than anything had so far. If I was already seeing things that were not there, how much longer before I walked off the road entirely without realizing it? The highway was my only guide, the only thing keeping me pointed in the right direction. And if I lost it, I would be wandering in circles until I collapsed. I tried to focus harder, tried to keep my eyes on the asphalt directly in front of me, but my vision kept going blurry at the edges, and I had to blink constantly to clear it. The tears would freeze almost instantly, gluing my eyelids together for a half second each time, and wiping them away with my frozen gloves just made it worse. I realized I had stopped feeling cold, which should have been a relief, but I knew it was actually a very bad sign. When you stop shivering, when the cold stops hurting, that means your body has given up trying to warm itself. That means you are in serious trouble. I do not know exactly when I left the road. That is the part that haunts me when I try to piece together what happened. The gap in my memory, where the highway just disappears, and suddenly I was walking through open snow with no idea how I got there. One moment I was following the dark line of asphalt, telling myself to keep going, keep moving, and the next I was knee-deep in powder with nothing around me but white in every direction. I must have wandered off during one of those foggy moments when my brain checked out, maybe saw another phantom building in the distance and walked toward it without thinking. I tried to turn around, tried to find the road again, but everything looked exactly the same. Flat white ground meeting gray-blue sky and a perfect circle around me, like I was standing in the center of an empty dome. I picked a direction and started walking, telling myself it had to be the right way. But even as I moved, I knew I was guessing, knew I could be walking deeper into nothing instead of back toward the highway. The sun was almost gone now, just a thin red line on the horizon, and the temperature was dropping even further. I could feel it in my chest, each breath harder than the last, like the air itself was thickening into something my lungs could not process. My legs stopped working properly somewhere in that white emptiness. First, they just felt heavy, like I was wading through water, and then they started refusing to bend the way I wanted them to. I fell twice, maybe 3 times, and getting back up took longer each time. The last time I went down, I remember lying there in the snow and thinking how soft it was, how it almost felt warm compared to the air, how maybe I could just rest here for a minute before continuing. Part of my brain was screaming at me to get up, screaming that this was exactly how people die. But that voice seemed far away now, like someone yelling from another room. I managed to push myself to my knees, then to my feet, but standing felt like an achievement that took everything I had. I looked around and realized I could not see anything anymore. Not the road, not the sun, not any landmark at all. Just darkness creeping in from every direction and the snow beneath my feet, and this incredible tiredness that made every thought feel like pushing a boulder uphill. I took a few more steps, maybe 10 or 20, and then I stopped. Not because I decided to stop, but because my body simply would not go any further. My legs locked up, my knees buckled, and I went down into the snow one final time. I woke up in a hospital in Fairbanks 3 days later, and for the first few hours I had no idea where I was or how I got there. A nurse told me that a snowplow driver found my truck on the highway and called it in, and that search and rescue teams had been looking for me since the next morning. They found my trail of footprints leading away from the vehicle, followed them for about 4 miles along the road, and then tracked where I had wandered off into the open terrain. The footprints just stopped, she said, in the middle of a flat white field about 2 miles from the highway. No body, no sign of where I went after that. They searched for hours with dogs and helicopters, expanding the radius, checking every depression in the snow. A volunteer on a snowmobile finally spotted me nearly a mile from where my tracks ended, lying face down in a shallow ditch that had been invisible from the air. My core temperature when they got me to the medical center was 26 degrees Celsius. The doctors said anything below 28 is usually fatal, that most people do not come back from that. I lost 3 toes on my left foot and 2 on my right, plus the tips of 4 fingers. The surgeon told me I was lucky, and I wanted to laugh at him, but I did not have the energy. What I cannot stop thinking about even now is that gap between where my footprints stopped and where they found me. Almost a full mile of distance with no tracks, no trail, nothing to show how I got there. The rescue team leader visited me in the hospital and admitted he had never seen anything like it. The snow was undisturbed, fresh powder that would have shown every step, but there was just nothing, like I had been picked up and set down somewhere else. He asked if I remembered walking that distance, and I told him the truth, that I do not remember anything after falling that last time until I woke up in this bed. The doctors say it was probably some kind of automatic response, my body moving on its own while my conscious mind was completely shut down. A last survival instinct that kept me crawling toward that ditch where the wind was blocked and the snow provided insulation. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe my body saved itself while I was not home. But sometimes late at night, when I look at the stumps where my toes used to be and feel the phantom ache in my missing fingertips, I wonder about those invisible steps. I wonder what part of me was still walking when the rest of me had already given up. I drove through Alaska thinking I understood cold, thinking I was prepared, and I learned that there are things about your own body and your own mind that you will never understand, not even when they save your life. Seattle had given me everything I thought I wanted: a steady job at a busy clinic, a decent apartment, friends who understood the chaos of 12-hour shifts. But somewhere around my 10th year as a nurse practitioner, the routine started to feel like a slow suffocation. I needed something different, not just a change of scenery, but a complete reset. The kind you only get when you put 1,000 miles between yourself and everything familiar. When I saw the posting for a public health position in Koyukuk, a village of about 200 people in interior Alaska, something clicked. My nursing school classmates were buying houses in the suburbs, scheduling playdates, posting photos of their kitchen renovations. Meanwhile, I was signing a 2-year contract to work in a place most people could not find on a map. The salary was decent, housing was provided, and the job description mentioned everything from wellness checks to emergency response. My mother cried when I told her. My father just shook his head and asked if I had lost my mind. I arrived in Koyukuk on the last day of August, when the tundra was still gold and rust-colored, and the daylight stretched past 9 at night. A bush plane dropped me at a gravel airstrip about half a mile from the village center, and a man named Irving Tukala picked me up in a battered pickup truck that looked older than me. Irving worked for the tribal council and had been assigned to help me settle in. He was maybe 60, with deep lines carved into his face and hands that looked like they had been shaped by decades of hard labor. He did not say much during the drive, just pointed out landmarks: the community center, the general store, the fuel depot. When we passed a cluster of houses set apart from the others, he slowed down slightly. "Moreau family," he said, his voice flat. "They keep to themselves." I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. Small towns always have their dynamics, their unspoken boundaries. I had no idea that those 3 words would become the first thread of something I wish I had never pulled. My first few weeks went smoothly enough. The health clinic was a small building with peeling paint and equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum, but it was functional. I saw patients for everything from ear infections to diabetes management, and most people were friendly in that reserved, cautious way that comes from living in tight-knit communities. I learned to read the silences as much as the words. A woman named Ruthie Anaktavuk became my unofficial guide to village life. She worked at the general store and had a way of explaining things without making me feel like an outsider. She told me which families had been there for generations, which had arrived more recently, and which ones I should just leave alone. When I asked about the Moreaus, her face changed. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. They handle their own problems, she said, and then she changed the subject to the weather forecast. I let it go, but something about her reaction stayed with me like a splinter I could not reach. It was mid-September when the first real incident happened. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, came into the clinic with her mother. The girl had a gash on her forearm that clearly needed stitches, deep enough that I could see the white of tissue beneath the blood. But when I started preparing the suture kit, the mother grabbed her daughter and pulled her toward the door. "We changed our minds," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It will heal on its own." I tried to explain the risk of infection, the likelihood of scarring, but she was already gone. I stood there in the empty exam room holding a needle and thread, feeling like I had just witnessed something I did not understand. When I mentioned it to Ruthie later that day, she got very quiet. "That was Celeste Moreau," she finally said. "Her daughter Elise. They do not come to the clinic, they never have." I asked her why, and she just shook her head. "Some questions are better left alone out here." October came fast, and with it the cold. Not the crisp autumn chill I knew from the Pacific Northwest, but something deeper. A cold that seemed to seep into the walls, into your bones, into your thoughts. The daylight was shrinking rapidly, and by the end of the month we had maybe 6 hours of weak sunlight before the darkness swallowed everything again. I spent more time in the clinic going through old records, partly out of boredom, and partly because the incident with the Moreau girl kept nagging at me. The filing system was a mess, decades of paper records stuffed into cabinets with no real organization. But as I started sorting through them, patterns began to emerge. Death certificates mostly. In a village this small, you expect to see deaths from the usual causes: age, accidents, the occasional illness. What I did not expect was how many of those accidents involved the same handful of family names: Moreau, Ivanov, Tulik. Over and over again. Drownings, falls, exposure, hunting mishaps. All ruled accidental by whatever authority had signed off on them, but the frequency was staggering. In the past 15 years, I counted 11 deaths among those 3 families alone. 11, in a village of 200 people. I started making a list, writing down dates and names and causes of death on a yellow legal pad I kept hidden in my desk drawer. Maybe I was paranoid, maybe I was just a city girl looking for drama in a quiet place. But then I noticed something else. The deaths were not random. They clustered around the same time each year, mostly between late October and early December, when the village was at its most isolated. When the rivers froze, but the ice was not yet thick enough for safe travel. When the bush planes stopped flying because of weather. When getting out of Koyukak became nearly impossible. I sat in my small clinic office with that legal pad in front of me, the wind howling outside, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Someone was dying in this village almost every year, right around this time, and everyone was pretending it was normal. I made the mistake of asking questions. Not directly, not at first. I thought I was being subtle. I mentioned to Irving that I had been organizing the old records and noticed a lot of accidents over the years. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then said, "Alaska is a dangerous place. People die." That was it. Conversation over. I tried a different approach with Ruthie, asking about the Ivanov and Tulik families, whether they were related to the Moreaus. She stopped stocking shelves and turned to face me with something in her eyes I had not seen before. Fear, maybe, or warning. "You are a good person," she said slowly. "You came here to help, so let me help you. Stop looking at those old papers. Stop asking about those families. Just do your job, get through the winter, and when spring comes you can decide if you want to stay or go. But right now you need to stop." Her voice was barely above a whisper by the end. I wanted to argue, to push back, but the look on her face made the words die in my throat. She was genuinely afraid, and not for herself. That night I came home to find my cabin door unlocked. I always locked it. That was a habit from Seattle that I never broke. My first thought was that maybe I had forgotten, that the isolation was getting to me. But when I stepped inside and turned on the light, I knew someone had been there. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. But my desk drawers were open, and the yellow legal pad where I had been keeping my notes was sitting in the middle of my bed. It had been in my clinic office. Someone had taken it, brought it here, and left it where I would be sure to find it. A message. I picked up the pad and flipped through it. All my notes were still there. Every name and date I had written down. But on the last page, someone had added a single sentence in handwriting that was not mine. "The winter is long and accidents happen." I stood there in my freezing cabin holding that legal pad, and for the first time since I arrived in Koyukuk, I felt truly afraid. Not curious, not unsettled, afraid. Because whoever wrote that note knew exactly what I had been doing, and they wanted me to know that they knew. I should have stopped. Any rational person would have stopped. But fear does strange things to you. Sometimes it paralyzes, and sometimes it pushes you to do exactly what you should not do. The next morning, I went to the tribal council office and asked to see the village census records from the past 20 years. The woman behind the desk, someone I had never spoken to before, looked at me like I had asked for the nuclear launch codes. She said the records were not available to outside contractors, that I would need special permission from the council elders. I asked how I could get that permission. She smiled without warmth and said the council only met once a month, and the next meeting was not until December. I walked out of that office knowing I had just put another target on my back. That afternoon, I tried to call my mother using the satellite phone at the community center, the only reliable way to reach the outside world. The phone was broken. It had worked fine the week before. The man who ran the center, a quiet guy named Amos Chukwu, said a part needed to be ordered and it would take a few weeks. He did not look at me when he said it. November arrived like a door slamming shut. The last supply plane came in on the 3rd, and the pilot told me the weather window was closing fast. He asked if I wanted to leave, said he could make room for one more passenger. I thought about it. I thought about the note on my bed, the broken satellite phone, the way people had started looking at me differently, like I was a problem that needed to be managed. But leaving felt like surrendering to something I did not understand, and some stubborn part of me refused to give them that satisfaction. So I watched the plane take off and disappear into a gray sky, and I told myself I had made the right choice. By the middle of the month, the river was frozen solid, and the snow was waist-deep in places. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero, then 40. The village became a small cluster of lights in an endless darkness, cut off from everything. And somewhere out there in one of those houses, people were waiting for something. I did not know what, not yet, but I was about to find out. It was November 19th when Ruthie came to my cabin after dark. She had never visited me at home before, and when I opened the door and saw her standing there in the cold, her breath coming out in white clouds, I knew something had changed. She pushed past me without waiting to be invited, and stood in the middle of my small living room, rubbing her hands together. "There is going to be an accident soon," she said, her voice tight. "The Moreaus owe a debt. They have owed it for 3 generations. The Ivanovs and the Tuliks, they owed debts too. That is how it works here. That is how it has always worked. I asked her what she meant by debt, and she told me a story that made everything click into a horrible place. Decades ago, before the village had any real connection to the outside world, the founding families made agreements with each other. Land rights, hunting territories, marriages, resources. When someone broke an agreement or wronged another family, there was a price. Not money, not property, blood. A life for a life passed down through generations until the debt was paid. It sounded insane, like something out of a history book about feudal societies. But Ruthie was not joking, and the fear in her eyes was absolutely real. She told me that the Moreau family had one more death owed to the Chukwu family, a wrong committed by someone's great-grandfather that had never been settled. This year, the debt was being called in. Elise, the little girl I had tried to help in September, was the one they had chosen. That was why her mother refused medical treatment. In their minds, there was no point in healing someone who was already marked. I felt sick. I asked Ruthie why she was telling me this, why now, and she said it was because I was the only person in the village who might actually do something. Everyone else had grown up with this system. They accepted it the way you accept gravity, not because it was right, but because it had always been there. Outsiders were usually discouraged from staying long enough to notice anything. But I had noticed, and I had kept asking questions, and now I was the only wild card in a game that had been playing out for generations. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my cabin with every light on, thinking through my options. Running was not possible. The snow was too deep, the cold too extreme, and the nearest town was over 60 miles away through wilderness. The satellite phone was still broken. I had no way to contact anyone outside, but I had something else: the clinic. Medical supplies, locked cabinets, and most importantly, a shortwave radio that I had seen in the back storage room during my first week. It was old and covered in dust, probably left over from the 80s, but it might still work. Before dawn, I walked to the clinic through knee-deep snow, my flashlight cutting a thin beam through the darkness. The radio was exactly where I remembered it. Took me almost an hour to figure out how to operate it, my fingers numb and clumsy. But finally I managed to reach a state trooper station in Fairbanks. I told them everything: the pattern of deaths, the threats, the little girl who was in danger. The officer on the other end sounded skeptical at first, but something in my voice must have convinced him, because he said he would send a team as soon as the weather cleared. He told me to stay inside, keep my head down, and wait. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I stayed in the clinic, sleeping on the exam table, eating canned food from the emergency supplies. On the second day, someone tried the door handle in the middle of the night. It was locked, and whoever it was eventually went away, but I did not close my eyes again until morning. On the fourth day, I heard the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the frozen air. 2 state troopers and a child welfare officer landed on the outskirts of the village, and within hours, Elise Moreau was in protective custody. I do not know exactly what happened after that. I was evacuated on the same helicopter and never went back. I heard later that several people were arrested, that the investigation uncovered evidence of at least 7 deaths that were being reclassified as homicides. The village of Koyukak was all over the news for a few weeks, and then the world moved on to other horrors. I still have the yellow legal pad with the threat written on the last page. Sometimes I take it out and look at that handwriting, and I wonder who wrote it. I wonder if they are still out there in some other small place keeping old debts alive. And I wonder how many other villages exist where the winter is long and accidents happen and nobody asks why. Working at a temporary construction camp in Alaska felt like a strange pause in my life, something I told myself was just a means to an end. I'd taken the job because the pay was good, and I needed to clear some debts, and the camp promised short rotations and long stretches of time off. At that point, my life was simple and quiet, mostly work, sleep, and the occasional call home when the satellite signal cooperated. The camp itself sat far from any real town, surrounded by uneven ground, frozen mud, and a horizon that never felt close. Rows of portable trailers were bolted into the dirt like they might slide away if no one watched them. Most of us were strangers to each other, passing through, carrying our own reasons for being there. That made it easy to keep your head down and mind your business. It also made it easy for things to happen without anyone asking too many questions. The day everything started to bother me wasn't dramatic at first, just oddly quiet. A guy named Trevor, who bunked 2 trailers down from me, didn't show up for breakfast. No note, no warning, just his locker cleared out and his boots gone. People said he'd quit overnight, which wasn't unheard of, but the way everyone accepted it felt rehearsed. This wasn't the first time either. Over the previous months, workers had vanished from the schedule between shifts. No goodbye drinks, no heated arguments with supervisors, nothing you'd expect from someone leaving suddenly. Management always brushed it off as personal issues or better offers elsewhere. The explanations were thin, but nobody pushed back. In a place like that, asking questions made you stand out. That night I worked the late shift, doing equipment checks near the edge of the camp where the lights barely reached. The generators hummed unevenly, and the cold crept through my gloves no matter how tightly I clenched my fingers. Somewhere past the trailers, I heard raised voices, low and sharp, like an argument being swallowed by the wind. I couldn't see who it was, only the outline of someone moving between structures, staying close to the shadows. When I walked closer, the voices stopped instantly, leaving behind an empty stretch of gravel and a feeling that I'd interrupted something I wasn't meant to see. Later, in the break room, a newer worker named Eli sat staring at the floor, jaw clenched, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He clocked out early and didn't come back. By the next morning, Eli's trailer was locked and stripped bare, same as Trevor's. This time, though, I noticed scuff marks near the steps, deep grooves in the mud that looked like someone had been dragged or pushed hard. I brought it up quietly to a supervisor, who gave me a tight look and told me to focus on my job. That response stuck with me more than the marks themselves. Over lunch, a few of us traded glances but kept our mouths shut, the unspoken agreement hanging heavy in the air. Everyone sensed there was something ugly underneath these disappearances. The camp's isolation made it feel like its own world, one where rules bent easily and consequences stayed far away. By the end of that morning, I realized the problem wasn't just people leaving. It was what might have been happening to them before they did. After that, I started paying closer attention to the little things people usually ignored. Conversations would stop when certain footsteps passed by the trailers. A few workers flinched at raised voices, even when it was just joking around. One night during dinner, I noticed bruising along the neck of a guy named Marcus, half hidden by his jacket collar. When I asked if he was okay, he forced a laugh and said he'd slipped on ice. The explanation didn't match the marks, which were too narrow and uneven. He left camp 2 days later without collecting his last paycheck. Management posted his position as open before his bunk was even cleaned out. It felt like the camp itself swallowed people whole, erased them, and moved on. The tension peaked during a night shift when one of the welders, Aaron, failed to check in at the end of his rotation. His radio crackled with static when we tried to reach him, and the supervisor delayed organizing a search, insisting Aaron probably wandered off to cool down somewhere. That excuse made no sense in freezing conditions, especially with the terrain around us. When we finally went looking, we found his helmet near a storage container, dented and smeared with dark residue. No blood trail, no signs of a fall, just silence and the wind dragging loose plastic against metal. By morning, Aaron was officially listed as having quit mid-shift. Seeing that typed out on the board felt unreal, like watching someone rewrite reality. A few days later, investigators arrived after someone finally contacted authorities outside the camp. They spoke to us one by one in a makeshift office, asking careful questions about threats, fights, and people leaving suddenly. What surprised me was how similar everyone's stories were once they felt safe talking. Intimidation in dark hallways, warnings delivered in whispers, physical confrontations that were never reported. One name kept surfacing, always followed by nervous pauses. The camp's setup made it easy for one person to control space and information, especially with new workers rotating in constantly. Oversight was minimal, records sloppy, and complaints quietly buried. Listening to it all laid out made me realize this wasn't a series of bad coincidences. The investigation uncovered years of ignored reports and unofficial settlements, all designed to keep the project running without disruption. The person responsible had learned exactly how far they could go, without triggering intervention, exploiting isolation and fear like tools. Workers who resisted were pressured into leaving, while others stayed silent to protect their paychecks. Eventually, the suspect was removed from the site under guard, though details were never fully shared with us. The camp didn't shut down, it just adjusted, pretending the problem had been solved cleanly. Even after things returned to a surface-level normal, the atmosphere never recovered. Every sound after dark carried weight, and trust between co-workers felt permanently damaged. I stayed long enough to see the investigators leave and the company issue a short statement about improved safety protocols. Nothing about the people who vanished, nothing about Aaron, nothing about the fear that had settled into the camp like a second climate. A few trailers were moved, a new supervisor rotated in, and we were told to report anything unusual. The words sounded empty by then. At night, the camp still felt watched, even with extra lighting and new faces around. People avoided being alone after dark, pairing up for cigarette breaks or bathroom runs. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts, broken by every sound of metal shifting or boots crunching outside. The place had learned our routines, and we couldn't unlearn what it had shown us. The day I decided to leave came quietly, without drama. I packed my duffel in the early morning, hands moving on instinct while my mind replayed small moments I hadn't questioned before. The way certain doors were always locked, the lack of cameras near storage areas, the silence from management when complaints surfaced. None of it felt accidental anymore. I turned in my badge without explaining myself, and no one asked why. That part disturbed me the most. It was as if the camp expected departures, accepted them as part of its design. When the transport truck pulled away, I watched the trailers shrink into the distance, lined up neatly like they hadn't held anything terrible inside them. Months later, back in normal life, the memories still surface at odd times. A generator hum can pull me right back to those nights, or the smell of diesel mixed with cold air. I read about similar camps online, and see the same patterns repeated in different places. Temporary jobs, isolated locations, workers who pass through without roots. It creates gaps where accountability should be, and those gaps invite the wrong kind of people. I don't know what ultimately happened to everyone who disappeared. Some may have escaped before things got worse, others might not have been so lucky. That uncertainty is harder to live with than a clear answer. I'm sharing this here because places like that don't advertise their dangers. They sell opportunity, fast money, and the idea that you can endure anything for a short time. What I learned is that isolation changes the rules, and silence can be trained into people without them noticing. If you ever find yourself somewhere remote where people vanish quietly and no one wants to talk about it, pay attention. Leaving without explanation might look strange from the outside, but sometimes it's the only option left. I walked away with my life and a story that still doesn't sit right. Others didn't even get that much. At that point in my life, I was drifting between seasonal jobs, chasing contracts the way some people chase weather. Alaska felt like the right kind of distance. I was in my late 20s, traveling alone, working temporary gigs wherever someone needed an extra pair of hands before winter shut everything down. I didn't have much tying me anywhere, just a packed car, a notebook with phone numbers, and a habit of trusting my own planning a little too much. That morning started like dozens of others on the road. Cheap coffee, stiff muscles, and a long stretch of highway waiting ahead. I remember thinking that if I could reach the next town before dark, everything would stay on schedule. The light was already thinner than I liked, stretched low and pale across the road. Still, nothing about the day felt dramatic or unusual. It felt routine, and that's what makes it hard to explain now. The roadside stop sat alone against miles of nothing. A squat building with buzzing fluorescent lights, and a parking lot chewed up by gravel. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee and old fryer oil, the kind that sticks to your clothes. The woman behind the counter had tired eyes and kept glancing at the clock on the wall, tapping her pen like she was counting down to freedom. I told her I was heading toward the next town and expected to be there before nightfall. She gave me a look that lingered a second too long, then said something vague about the road being quiet lately. There was a corkboard near the door with handwritten notes for rides, missing dogs, odd local ads. One of the papers had been torn halfway down, as if someone changed their mind mid-sentence. I paid, thanked her, and walked back outside with that image still stuck in my head. The drive after that felt different, though nothing obvious had changed. The highway narrowed and twisted, the trees pressing closer, swallowing sound. Radio stations dissolved into static, then vanished altogether, leaving only the low hum of the engine. I noticed a vehicle behind me for a while, dark-colored, hard to pin down, but it never got close enough for me to read anything useful. When it finally disappeared, the absence felt louder than its presence had. I kept checking the dashboard clock, doing mental math about distance and fading daylight. The sky was slipping toward that heavy blue-gray that comes fast in remote places. I told myself I was imagining tension where there was none. Being alone that long messes with your head. Or at least that's what I believed then. The last clear memory I have of that stretch comes from pulling over near a wide shoulder, thinking I should double-check my map before continuing. The engine cut, and the silence rushed in immediately, thick and pressing. My keys weren't in the cup holder where I always dropped them, which struck me as odd enough to make my chest tighten. I searched the seats, the floor, the console, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. That's when I noticed how untouched everything else was. My bag still zipped, jacket folded the way I'd left it. No sign that anyone had been inside the car. The road was empty in both directions, stretching endlessly, offering no clues and no comfort. Standing there, surrounded by wilderness that didn't care whether I existed or not, I understood how easy it would be for someone to vanish without a sound. What I didn't realize at the time was how quickly small decisions start stacking up when you're isolated. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the wind scrape through the brush and feeling watched without seeing anyone. After a while, I noticed impressions in the gravel that didn't match my tires, faint but fresh, angled as if another vehicle had stopped nearby and then rolled on. It bothered me enough to make me scan the tree line, counting breaths, telling myself to stay calm and practical. I locked the car out of habit even though I couldn't find the keys, and that contradiction made my head spin. The light kept thinning, draining color from everything, and the idea of waiting there suddenly felt reckless. I decided to walk a short distance down the highway, thinking maybe the keys had fallen when I stepped out. That choice still echoes in my mind. The road felt longer on foot, every sound magnified by the emptiness. Gravel shifted under my boots, loud enough to make me wince. After a few minutes, I heard an engine somewhere behind me, slow and steady, not rushing. I moved closer to the shoulder, rehearsing what I'd say if someone stopped, friendly but guarded, grateful but not desperate. The vehicle passed without slowing, close enough that I caught a glimpse of the driver's profile. Eyes forward, jaw tight, both hands high on the wheel. No wave, no acknowledgement. The wind carried the smell of exhaust for a moment, then swallowed it. That was when the reality of my situation settled in fully. Night was coming fast, and I was suddenly very alone. I turned back toward my car, faster now, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't neatly explain. The sky had deepened into a dull, bruised color, and the forest on either side looked denser than before, like it had crept closer while I wasn't looking. When I reached the spot where I'd left the car, my stomach clenched, not from panic, but from disbelief. The car was still there exactly as I'd left it, but the driver's door stood open a few inches. Inside, nothing was disturbed. No broken glass, no mess, no obvious signs of interference. Just the quiet and the open door, waiting. I shut it slowly, every sense tuned tight, trying to decide whether staying or leaving on foot made more sense. I spent that night inside the car, curled up low, conserving heat and listening to every shift in the air. At some point, footsteps passed nearby, careful and measured, stopping just far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint them. No voice, no flashlight beam, no sudden movement, just the unmistakable sound of someone standing there, deciding something. Eventually, the steps retreated, dissolving back into the dark. When morning finally came, gray and weak, the keys were sitting on the hood, neatly placed as if to be found. I didn't question it. I got in, started the engine, and drove until I reached a town with people and noise and walls. I reported what happened, and searches were done, but nothing else turned up. Even now, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I only know that the isolation didn't protect me. It exposed me. After I reached that town, everything moved fast in a way that felt unreal. People asked questions while handing me coffee, while filling out forms, while glancing at each other when I described the open door and the keys on the hood. They focused on timelines, directions, mile markers. I kept trying to explain the feeling of being evaluated out there, like someone had been testing how far they could push before I broke. Search teams went back along the highway before the light faded again, combing ditches and tree lines, marking spots with little flags. I watched from the edge of the road, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, feeling strangely detached from my own story. Everyone kept saying how lucky I was. I nodded because that's what you do when you don't have the words to disagree. As the day stretched on, the questions shifted. Had I noticed anyone at the roadside stop? Did anyone seem too interested in my plans? I mentioned the board with the torn paper, the look the woman gave me when I talked about reaching town before night. One of the officers exchanged a glance with another and wrote something down without comment. They asked if I'd heard rumors about people disappearing along that route. I hadn't, but the way they phrased it told me enough. The wilderness wasn't just empty, it was useful. Miles of road, few witnesses, long delays before anyone noticed something was wrong. Anyone patient enough could wait out there and never leave a trace. By evening, they told me there was nothing more to do until morning. I sat alone in a small room at a motel, staring at my phone, replaying every choice I'd made since sunrise. I realized how close I'd come to doing exactly what I said at the counter, pushing forward until dark, trusting the road to take care of me. If I hadn't stopped when I did, if I'd ignored that missing key moment, the story might have ended very differently. The thought didn't come with dramatic fear, just a dull, heavy certainty. Some mistakes don't announce themselves. They wait quietly for you to be tired enough to make them. I left Alaska not long after that. I finished the contract I was there for, but the rest of the trip felt hollow, like I was moving through someone else's life. I still think about that stretch of highway and how calm everything looked on the surface. People ask if I believe someone was responsible, or if it was just coincidence and bad luck brushing up against isolation. I don't argue either way. All I know is that the road gave someone an opportunity, and that opportunity almost included me. When I tell this now, it's not for answers. It's so someone else might hesitate at a lonely stop and decide not to trust the distance the way I did.